I never expected my own nephew to slam his hand on my desk and say, "You're old. We're taking over your business." He wasn't alone. My brother had plotted this for months, scheming behind my back to seize control. And I had a plan they couldn't even imagine. Hit subscribe if you believe life always finds a way to balance the scales. Because this story proves it. I never thought the day would come when my own blood would look at me and dismiss my life's work like it was nothing. Yet, here he was. My nephew, Jason, barely 28, standing in my office with a smug grin and eyes that radiated entitlement. "You're old," he said, slamming his hand on my polished oak desk. "We're taking over your business." I froze. The words hit harder than any physical blow. I had spent decades building this company from the ground up. A tiny repair shop that now serviced hundreds of clients each month. Every scar, every sleepless night, every sacrifice had led to this moment. And now, it felt like it meant nothing. Jason leaned back in my chair, like he owned the place. "Come on, Uncle. Step aside. This is our time. You've had your fun." I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came. My brother, Mark, was sitting beside him, arms crossed, the same smugness plastered across his face. I had suspected something like this for months, but to witness it unfold in my own office was a blow I hadn't anticipated. "You've always been overprotective," Mark said with a fake sigh. "It's time you let go. We're the next generation. You need to retire." I felt a tight knot in my stomach. Betrayal, pure and unfiltered, had a taste. I wanted to scream, throw things, demand respect, but I didn't. I had learned over the years that anger without planning only leads to regret. I swallowed my pride and nodded slowly. "All right," I said, keeping my voice calm, almost too calm. "Let's talk numbers tomorrow. We'll see what can be done." Both of them exchanged a glance, a silent celebration, mistaking my patience for weakness. It hadn't always been like this. 35 years ago, I was just a kid with a toolbox and a dream. My father had passed, leaving me with nothing but grit and determination. I opened a small garage in the back of a rented space, barely managing to pay the bills. My hands bled, my nights were restless, and my family doubted me at every step. Yet I persisted. I saved every penny, reinvested, and eventually purchased my first property, a modest brick building on Main Street. That building was the first real sign that I was building something lasting. Over the decades, I expanded, hired staff, and built a reputation that made clients trust me as much as family. I never bragged about my achievements to Mark or Jason. I didn't need their validation. But it seems they had been watching all along, waiting for me to show a sign of weakness. Jason leaned forward, smirking. "You know, Uncle, it's really sweet that you think this is yours. But times change. You can't fight progress." Mark nodded in agreement. "Yeah, we've got plans, Uncle. Big plans. You just slow us down." I let them talk, letting their arrogance fill the room. Inside, a storm was brewing, but it wasn't visible. I remembered every moment they had ever underestimated me. Every time my brother had belittled my decisions. Every time Jason had thrown tantrums as a kid. Every disrespect had been noted, cataloged, and stored, because revenge is nothing without patience. "You know," I finally said, my voice soft but firm, "you're making a big assumption that I don't see what's going on." Jason laughed, a high-pitched, dismissive sound. "See what? You're overthinking. You're just old. Let it go." I smiled, but not in the way they expected. It was a cold, measured smile. "You might think that now, but there are things you don't know." "What could we not know?" Mark sneered. "Come on, don't keep us in suspense." I didn't answer. Not yet. That silence spoke louder than any words. They didn't know it, but the building itself, the property that housed the company they thought they could seize, was mine. Every brick, Every beam, every square foot was registered in my name. Every lease clause, every insurance detail, every contingency plan had been thought through long ago. After they left, I slumped into my chair. My hands shook slightly, not from fear, but from rage. How dare they? How dare they assume they could walk in here and take everything I had built? But as the initial wave of anger subsided, clarity emerged. This wasn't just about ego or pride. This was about legacy, about justice, about showing the next generation that entitlement does not equate to power. I walked through the building, touching the walls, looking at the photographs of my early days, the framed certificates, the awards. Everything I had worked for was here, and now it was under threat, not from outsiders, but from family. I remembered my first employee, Carl, who had believed in me when nobody else did. I thought of the clients who had trusted me with their livelihoods. This wasn't just my fight. It was a fight for every person who had ever believed in me. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, drinking black coffee, staring at the city lights through the window. I had a plan forming, a way to turn this betrayal into their ultimate humiliation. But it had to be precise. It had to be perfect. Jason and Mark thought they were clever, thinking that youth and audacity could overpower experience. They didn't realize that I had spent my life preparing for moments like this. Every lease clause, every contract, every financial record had a purpose. Every ally I had made over the years would soon become a part of this plan. I smiled again, this time with anticipation. The first move hadn't been made yet. But when it was, they wouldn't just be stopped. They would be exposed for the greedy, entitled fools they were, and I would stand at the center, calm, composed, and victorious. Before going to bed, I pulled out an old ledger from my safe. Inside were the papers proving full ownership of the building. Every attempt they made to seize control legally, financially, or physically would fail. I whispered to myself, they have no idea who they're really messing with. And just like that, the storm was set in motion. The next morning, I arrived at the office earlier than usual. The sunlight spilled across the floor, but it couldn't chase away the tension that had settled like a shadow in the air. Jason and Mark were already there, chatting with a few of my staff. Their voices loud, mocking, as if the building already belonged to them. "Looks like you're finally learning, Uncle," Jason called out with a smirk. "We're taking over today. You can't stop progress." I walked past them, nodding at employees, who looked anxious but unsure. I could feel their unease, but there was also loyalty in their eyes. They had seen the company grow under my guidance. They had seen my dedication. And deep down, I knew most of them were quietly rooting for me. I didn't speak to them directly. Words were unnecessary. Actions would speak louder. Over the next week, their plans started to take shape. Jason tried to charm my best clients, offering better deals and modern solutions, insinuating that I was out of touch. Mark dug into the finances, attempting to intimidate our accountant into approving unauthorized transfers. At first, it seemed minor, almost laughable. But as the days passed, I realized they were testing the boundaries, searching for weak points. They underestimated one thing. I had anticipated every move. I watched quietly, taking notes, recording emails, and reviewing the lease documents that confirmed my full ownership of the building. Every phone call, every meeting, every sly attempt to undermine me was being cataloged. Their arrogance was working in my favor. To the staff and outsiders, I allowed the illusion of weakness to continue. I appeared flustered during meetings, pretended to be unsure of decisions, and even let Jason make small victories that seemed harmless. Behind the scenes, I was meticulously planning. The building, the contracts, and every legal clause had been arranged for years. They didn't know it yet, but every action they took was driving them deeper into the trap I had set. I also reached out to old allies, contractors, business partners, even a few clients who owed me favors. They would be quietly watching, ready to assist when the moment came. While Jason and Mark acted like they were in control, the audience now knows the truth. The building they were attempting to seize wasn't just under my management. It was entirely mine. Every lease clause favored me. Every insurance policy listed me as the sole owner. Even the parking lot and storage areas, which they thought were communal, were legally mine. They were playing checkers while I was playing chess. And the best part, they had no idea. I spent long hours in the office alone, walking through corridors that smelled faintly of polish and old paper. I remembered the early days when I had personally fixed the plumbing, repaired the broken floors, and convinced the bank to trust me with my first mortgage. I thought of my brother Mark, and how jealousy had followed him his whole life, and Jason, who had grown up spoiled, shielded from hard work, and now thought entitlement equaled power. They had no concept of struggle, no understanding of sacrifice. Every insult, every act of defiance, every sneer they had given me fueled my resolve. I realized that their arrogance would be their downfall, and the only challenge was to time my move perfectly. One afternoon, Jason decided to escalate. He cornered one of my senior staff members, trying to convince them to sign over client accounts to him directly. "Come on," he said, leaning in too close. "You know he's old. Work with me. This is the future." The employee looked uncomfortable, glancing at me. I walked past the office door, pretending to be absorbed in paperwork, but I heard everything, and I noted every word. That evening, I reviewed the recordings and emails. Each attempt at sabotage, each manipulative tactic, they were unknowingly documenting their own betrayal. I smiled. Soon, this evidence would be used to secure not just my business, but my family's lesson in humility. I decided to test the waters. I called a long-time client, pretending to be uncertain about ongoing projects. Jason, thinking he could intercept the deal, sent a flurry of messages, and even tried to arrange a meeting without my knowledge. But the client, loyal to me for decades, bypassed Jason entirely. They called me directly, asking for guidance. I handled it calmly, subtly asserting authority, and made them promise to ignore any instructions from Jason until the situation was clarified. It was a small win, but a critical one. The illusion of weakness had allowed them to overreach, exposing the flaws in their plan. By the end of the week, the tension in the office was palpable. Jason and Mark were growing frustrated. They expected obedience, not resistance. Staff whispered in corners, unsure who to side with. I watched, silent and composed, the perfect storm forming. Every move they made, every overconfidence-driven mistake, brought them closer to the revelation I had been preparing. That night, I walked through the office one last time, alone. The lights reflected off polished surfaces, the hum of computers filling the empty rooms. I knew that the next week would be decisive. Jason and Mark had underestimated me entirely. As I stood at the window, looking out at the city lights, I whispered to myself, "They think they're winning, but their arrogance is their undoing. Soon, everything they've built on my illusion will crumble." The night before the final confrontation, I sat alone in my office, the city lights reflecting through the tall windows. The hum of the street below reminded me of how far I had come, from a young man with nothing but a toolbox to the owner of a thriving business and building that now stood as a testament to decades of hard work. The hum also reminded me that this fight wasn't just about a building or a company. It was about legacy, pride, and justice. I thought back to the first time I had purchased the property that now held my entire company. It had been 30 years ago. A modest brick building on Main Street, that I had scraped together every penny to afford. I remembered the bank officer's skeptical eyes when I walked in with a dream in my pocket and nothing else. Friends doubted me, family doubted me, and yet somehow I had convinced the officer to approve my mortgage. That building had been my first victory, my first step into building something lasting. Every day I had poured sweat, blood, and even tears into that place, fixing leaks, repainting walls, and convincing the first hesitant clients to trust a young man who had nothing but determination. Mark had never been impressed. He always thought he deserved what I had earned. Growing up, he had been a master at manipulation, the kind of person who would charm adults and lecture peers, but he had never worked for anything tangible. I remembered the day he walked out of the family home, claiming the world owed him a living, leaving me to shoulder the responsibilities I had taken on for years. And now, decades later, his son Jason was walking the same path, thinking entitlement equaled authority. Jason had grown up spoiled. He never knew the weight of hard work or the pain of sacrifice. His successes, if you could call them that, were handed to him by relatives or derived from shortcuts. He had no idea what it meant to stay awake all night, worrying if a client would pay, if a repair would fail, or if the business would survive another month. And now he was standing in my office, thinking he could take everything I had built in a week. I leaned back in my chair and traced my fingers over the edge of the desk, the surface polished smooth from years of use. I remembered the faces of employees who had believed in me when I had nothing to offer but promises. Carl, the first man I hired, had stayed with me for decades, trusting that I would never abandon the company we had built together. And now my own nephew and brother were attempting to dismantle it with arrogance and ignorance. Yet beneath the frustration and anger, a calm began to settle in. Patience had always been my greatest weapon, and it would serve me well now. They believed they were in control, that I was powerless, that I had been too old to keep up with the times. But that was the illusion. Every document, every clause, every bit of financial and legal preparation had been in place for years. They didn't know it, but they were walking into a trap designed specifically for their arrogance. I opened the ledger I had kept hidden for years, detailing every lease, every ownership stake, every contingency plan. The building, the entire property, was mine. Jason and Mark thought they could seize control, but legally, they had no ground to stand on. Every attempt they had made, from manipulating staff to wooing clients, had only confirmed their ignorance and overconfidence. I smiled to myself, imagining their faces when they finally realized they had been outmaneuvered from the start. I thought about the moments when I had almost faltered, when the weight of responsibility had felt unbearable. The nights I had slept on the couch because I couldn't afford the rent for a hotel, the times I had gone without food to pay for repairs, the arguments with my brother over trivialities that now seemed prophetic. Every hardship had prepared me for this moment. Every lesson, every defeat, had been a brick in the foundation of the man I had become. The next morning, I walked through the building quietly, noting every detail. The layout, the staff's routines, the clients who were loyal and those who could be swayed. They were all pieces on a chessboard I had memorized decades ago. Jason and Mark believed they had the advantage because they were younger, louder, more aggressive. But youth without wisdom is dangerous only to those who underestimate it. And I had never underestimated them. I found myself in the storage area, the place where I kept some of the original blueprints of the building and documents proving full ownership. I ran my fingers over the aged papers, feeling a sense of connection with the years of hard work and meticulous planning they represented. This was more than a building. It was my life, my identity, the proof that effort and perseverance could triumph over entitlement and arrogance. I remembered the first time I had mentored Jason, when he was a teenager. I had tried to teach him basic skills, responsibility, and respect for work. I remembered the way he had rolled his eyes, impatient, thinking he knew better. That moment had felt inconsequential then, but now it resonated with the patterns of his behavior as an adult. The seeds of entitlement had been planted early, and now they were blossoming into audacity. By mid-afternoon, Jason and Mark were becoming bolder. Jason had approached the receptionist, attempting to take over scheduling, while Mark had cornered the accountant, questioning numbers and threatening consequences for non-compliance. I observed silently, letting them expose themselves further. The arrogance in their eyes, the way they assumed compliance would follow, was exactly what I needed. They had underestimated the depth of my preparation. That evening, I called an old business partner, someone who had once saved me from financial ruin decades ago. I asked for a small favor, a subtle presence in the office the next day to observe and report back. They agreed without hesitation, trusting in the integrity I had always demonstrated. Little did they know, their role would be instrumental in what was about to unfold. As the sun set, I reflected on the irony of the situation. My own family, the people who should have been proud of my accomplishments, were attempting to dismantle them, and yet, the betrayal only strengthened my resolve. I felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that their ignorance, their impatience, and their arrogance were all building toward a moment of revelation they could never anticipate. I sat back in my chair and let my mind wander to the possible reactions once the truth was revealed. Jason would be stunned, likely speechless. Mark, with his ego and pride, would be furious. The employees, loyal and cautious, would finally see the man who had guided them, supported them, and protected them all these years. The clients, who had witnessed the minor chaos, would realize the difference between competence and incompetence, between experience and rashness. I allowed myself a rare smile. The pieces were in place. The trap had been carefully constructed over years, and now it would spring to life. Patience, preparation, and observation had brought me to this moment. Jason and Mark, in their youthful arrogance, had played right into it. Before leaving the office that night, I walked through each department, checking on details one last time. I greeted employees quietly, offering words of encouragement and subtle reassurance. They didn't need to know the full plan yet, but they felt the calm confidence radiating from me. That confidence would become essential in the days to come. Returning home, I reviewed the ledger one final time, making notes in double, checking legal points. I envisioned the confrontation, the moment when I would reveal ownership of the building and expose the folly of Jason and Mark's overconfidence. It would be decisive, satisfying, and fair. The evidence was irrefutable, and their actions had built the case against themselves. As I closed the ledger, I whispered to myself, tomorrow, they learn that age, experience, and preparation always win over arrogance. The next morning, the stage would be set. Jason and Mark believed they had the upper hand, but they had no idea who truly controlled the building they had so foolishly tried to seize. The morning air was crisp as I arrived at the office, the city just waking up around me. Inside, the tension was palpable. Jason and Mark were already there, striding through the corridors like conquerors. Staff avoided their eyes, whispering in corners, unsure of how to respond to the arrogance that had suddenly taken over their workplace. Jason swaggered into the main office, leaning against my desk, smirking. "See, Uncle, we're practically running the place now. Isn't it great?" I looked at him calmly, my expression neutral. "I see you're enthusiastic," I said, letting the words hang lightly in the air. "Enthusiastic. We're taking charge?" Mark said, stepping forward. Honestly, it's embarrassing that you haven't seen it coming. I smiled, but it was cold and measured. I knew the time had come. Every moment of their arrogance had led to this day. Every attempt to undermine me, every act of overconfidence, had set the stage for their reckoning. I pressed a button under my desk, sending a message to my lawyer, who had been waiting nearby. The law firm's representatives arrived quietly, unnoticed by Jason and Mark, and began handling the formal notices. Staff who had been loyal for decades quietly observed, knowing the moment of truth was at hand. Jason's smirk faltered slightly when the lawyer approached, documents in hand. "What's this?" he asked, trying to maintain confidence. "These are eviction notices and proof of ownership," the lawyer said calmly. "The building and all operations within are legally owned by Mr. Donovan." Mark froze. "What do you mean you own the building? We thought this was a company." "Your company." I leaned back in my chair, finally letting the calm authority I had cultivated for decades shine through. "The company operates in the building, yes. But the building itself, it's mine. Every lease, every clause, every square foot." Jason's face went pale. He opened his mouth, but no words came. He looked to his father for help, but Mark's jaw tightened as the realization sank in. Their plan, every manipulation, every attempt at control, had been futile from the start. Staff began to murmur among themselves, seeing the shift in power. Some glanced at me with newfound respect, while others watched the younger men's humiliation in silent satisfaction. The office that had been a battleground moments ago now held a different energy: authority, justice, and finally, clarity. Jason's arrogance turned to panic. He tried to reach for the documents, but the lawyer held them firmly, unreadable. "You had every chance to respect the business and its operations," I said. "Instead, you chose entitlement and manipulation. Now, you face the consequences." Mark's face reddened with fury. "This isn't over. You can't." "You underestimated me," I interrupted, my voice calm but sharp. "You thought age meant weakness. You thought experience meant nothing. You were wrong." The employees watched as the younger men, who had tried to assert dominance through bluster and intimidation, were reduced to stunned silence. They had assumed control was about loudness and aggression, but it was clear now that control required preparation, patience, and understanding, qualities they had dismissed. Jason looked around, desperate, realizing that not a single move he had made could counter the legal and financial groundwork I had laid. He finally stammered. "But, we thought." "You thought wrong," I said simply. "And now it's time to clean up the mess you created." One by one, staff members began to assist, quietly following my instructions. The receptionist redirected clients back to me. Loyal employees reinforced the procedures, and even some contractors, called in quietly, arrived to ensure operations continued smoothly without interference. Jason and Mark were left isolated, their arrogance evaporating in the face of precise and deliberate authority. As the morning unfolded, I explained to the employees and any clients who had witnessed confusion that everything was under control. Transparency and clarity replaced panic and uncertainty. It was more than just reclaiming control. It was restoring trust, loyalty, and respect. Jason's shoulders slumped. He no longer had the confidence to argue, to manipulate, or to threaten. Mark's fury was obvious, but even he could not reverse the legal facts in front of him. The building, the foundation of their plan, was mine. The evidence was clear, indisputable, and comprehensive. By noon, the office had returned to a sense of normalcy. The younger men had retreated to a corner, sulking, their schemes laid bare. Employees whispered quietly about the power of experience, patience, and intelligence over arrogance and entitlement. I allowed them a few moments to reflect, to witness justice being done without unnecessary drama. Finally, I stood before Jason and Mark, the authority in my voice unmistakable. "Consider this a lesson," I said. "Entitlement and arrogance will never outweigh experience and preparation. You assumed control was yours to take, but it is earned, not given. And when you learn that lesson, you may be ready for something like this one day." Jason's eyes welled slightly with frustration, anger, and the first trace of humility. Mark looked furious, but there was also a grudging acknowledgement. They had been outmaneuvered. I didn't relish their defeat. I relished the justice of it, the satisfaction of seeing their plans dismantled not through vengeance, but through preparation and wisdom. As I walked through the office, staff members smiled quietly, offering nods of respect. Clients who had been wary returned, reassured that the company was under competent leadership. The building itself, a symbol of decades of work, stood tall, unquestioned and secure. The trap had been executed perfectly, the lesson taught, and control restored. I returned to my office and looked out over the city skyline, thinking about how fleeting arrogance can be when confronted with patience, knowledge, and experience. Jason and Mark had thought they could take everything, but they had underestimated the depth of preparation, the importance of history, and the value of legacy. The office was quiet once more, the storm passed. The younger generation had learned a bitter lesson, and I had reaffirmed the truth I had lived by for decades, that control, respect, and success are earned, never assumed. By the following morning, the office had returned to a quiet order, but the atmosphere was charged with lessons learned and grudging respect. Jason and Mark no longer carried the swagger that had once filled the corridors. Their confidence had crumbled under the weight of truth and preparation, and they were now painfully aware of how thoroughly they had miscalculated. I called a meeting in the main office, inviting only the core staff and the two men who had tried to dominate the business. I stood before them, my posture calm and unwavering, as if nothing in the past weeks had shaken me. The room fell silent as I began to speak. "What happened here was not about punishment," I said. "It was about clarity, about understanding that arrogance and entitlement do not grant control, and that respect is earned through effort, diligence, and integrity." Jason's gaze dropped to the floor, while Mark clenched his fists, clearly grappling with frustration and humiliation. I allowed a brief pause, letting the words sink in. "You were given every opportunity to act responsibly, to learn, and to earn your place here. Instead, you chose manipulation and disrespect. Today, you see the result." Staff members exchanged glances, some whispering quietly, while others simply nodded. There was a sense of relief, of closure, and of witnessing justice being served without unnecessary drama. I continued. "This company, this building, and everything it represents are under the control of those who have earned it, through years of hard work and dedication. That includes every loyal employee here, and it always will." Jason lifted his head slightly, eyes glistening with the first traces of humility. I didn't realize," he began, his voice faltering. "You didn't realize what it takes to build something from nothing," I interrupted gently. "It's not flashy deals, it's not shortcuts, and it's certainly not entitlement. It's time, effort, patience, and respect for the process." Mark shifted uncomfortably. "So, we're just supposed to leave?" "Yes," I said calmly. "You've been shown the truth. Take it, learn from it, and grow. Perhaps one day you'll understand the value of what I've tried to teach you all these years." The two men left the office quietly, humbled and subdued. It was not a celebration of their defeat, but a moment of recognition they had underestimated wisdom and preparation. I turned to the staff, offering a small smile. "Now, let's get back to work." The company runs smoothly when everyone knows their role and respects the efforts of others. The remainder of the day was spent in rebuilding, reorganizing, and reaffirming the trust that had been strained over the past week. I walked through the departments, offering encouragement, advice, and quiet reassurance. The atmosphere shifted from tension to productivity, from uncertainty to confidence. By evening, I reflected on the events with a sense of satisfaction. The building stood secure, the business intact, and the lesson delivered. The younger generation had learned the hard way, and the employees who had witnessed the entire ordeal understood the importance of loyalty, diligence, and integrity. I also thought about the future. Jason and Mark were not gone permanently, but they had been shown the boundaries of respect. Their arrogance had been tempered, and now they had a chance to rebuild their understanding from the ground up. Sometimes, the harshest lessons are the most valuable. In the days that followed, the office returned to normal rhythm. Clients were reassured, contracts finalized, and the minor disruptions caused by the attempted takeover were resolved. Staff members expressed gratitude, not just for the restoration of order, but for the clarity and leadership they had witnessed. I often found myself walking through the empty corridors at night, reflecting on the journey that had brought me here. The building, once a simple brick structure, now symbolized more than business. It symbolized perseverance, wisdom, and the rewards of patience. Every corner, every desk, every office space carried the stories of decades of effort and dedication. Jason eventually approached me, a little more humble and a little less certain of his own judgment. I want to understand, he said quietly. I want to learn from this. Can you show me? I nodded slowly. Learning comes from patience and willingness, not arrogance. If you are sincere, I will teach you what I can, but understand that respect and effort are prerequisites for knowledge. Mark, too, reached out a week later, offering an apology that was more genuine than I had expected. I underestimated everything, he admitted. I see now what it truly takes to build and maintain something valuable. I accepted their apologies with measured grace. Forgiveness was not weakness. It was recognition that growth was possible even after arrogance had led to failure. Over time, I made a decision regarding the building itself. While I retained ownership, I chose to offer portions of operational responsibility to employees who had proven themselves loyal, dedicated, and competent. It was a calculated move, reinforcing the idea that authority is earned through commitment and trust. The business became not only secure, but also stronger, supported by those who genuinely valued its legacy. Jason and Mark continued to visit occasionally, now with humility, learning lessons that could only be taught through experience. The sting of their initial arrogance had left an impression that would last a lifetime, shaping their understanding of respect, effort, and leadership. As I stood in the office one evening, watching the sun set over the city, I felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The storm had passed, and clarity had emerged. The business, the building, and the legacy were intact. The lessons had been delivered, and the future was secure. I smiled quietly to myself, knowing that life often tests us in unexpected ways. Betrayal, arrogance, and overconfidence may come from those closest to us, but with preparation, patience, and resolve, even the most audacious challenges can be met and overcome. The final thought that lingered in my mind was simple yet profound: control, respect, and success are never given. They are earned, nurtured, and defended. And when they are, they endure, no matter who tries to claim them prematurely.